The Galactic Empire had ruled the stars for centuries, its dominance absolute and unquestioned. Across thousands of worlds, its fleets loomed, an iron fist that crushed rebellion before it could even take shape. To them, war was a simple equation: overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers, grind them down, and erase any thought of resistance. It had worked for centuries. The Empire's doctrine was built on the belief that no species could match their military machine. Their warships were vast, their armies endless, their technology unrivaled. Planets that defied them became graveyards, civilizations wiped out in the blink of an eye. No one had ever come close to challenging them. The Resistance had tried. A desperate coalition of weaker alien species, bound together by the simple will to survive. They had fought with everything they had, but it was never enough. Their fleets were scattered, their forces dwindling, and their hope dying. Every battle was the same. The Empire arrived in force, tore through their defenses, and left nothing behind but ruin. The war had dragged on for decades, a slow, merciless slaughter. Entire homeworlds were lost. Billions of lives were gone. The Resistance had begged for aid, pleaded with the few neutral powers left in the galaxy. No one answered. No one wanted to suffer the same fate. But there was one species that had never joined the fight. Humanity. The United Human Federation had remained silent. Isolated. Watching. No one knew why they had refused to intervene. Some believed they were afraid. Others thought they simply didn't care. But the Resistance had no other choice. With the Empire's fleets closing in on their final stronghold, they sent one last desperate plea. For the first time, humanity responded. The meeting was brief. A single human representative sat across from the Resistance leaders. No grand speeches. No promises. Just a simple, direct question. How long has this war lasted? 73 years, the Resistance leader answered, weariness etched into every word. The human nodded, as if contemplating something trivial. We'll have it finished in 7 hours. Confusion. Disbelief. Some thought it was a cruel joke. 7 hours. The war had dragged on for generations, consuming entire civilizations. It was impossible. The Resistance commander, a hardened veteran who had seen more death than he could count, demanded an explanation. The human only smiled. Just watch. The Empire, upon hearing of humanity's decision to enter the war, barely acknowledged it. To them, it was nothing more than another doomed species throwing itself into the fire. Humans had no empire, no fleets capable of matching their own. At best, they might delay the inevitable for a few hours. The Imperial High Command laughed. They didn't even bother to mobilize their full force. A single fleet would be enough. One swift strike, and humanity would be nothing more than another footnote in history. Their mistake was assuming humanity fought like everyone else. The first hour began with silence. No grand fleet formations. No massive armadas meeting in open battle. Just the eerie stillness of space. Then, the Empire's fleet lost contact with itself. Their communications collapsed in an instant. Orders couldn't be relayed. Formations broke. Confusion spread. Their admirals, trained in centuries of conventional warfare, had never seen anything like it. Their warships drifted, vulnerable, exposed. Then the killing started. Human ships moved in patterns that made no sense. No direct engagements. No predictable formations. They darted through enemy lines, their movements erratic, almost chaotic, except it wasn't chaos. Every maneuver was calculated. Every strike precise. The Empire's targeting systems failed. Sensors jammed. Weapons locked onto empty space or, worse, onto their own ships. Entire squadrons fired blindly, striking nothing or tearing through their own fleets. By the second hour, the Empire's forces were hemorrhaging ships without firing a single coordinated shot. Their admirals screamed for control, demanded answers, but none came. Their warships, the pride of the Empire, were turning into burning wreckage, one by one. They still didn't understand what was happening. Their fleets had never been defeated. Their tactics had never failed. They had never encountered an enemy they couldn't simply outgun. But this wasn't a battle of numbers. This was something else. Then came the cyber warfare. Every Imperial ship, no matter how advanced, relied on networks, navigation, targeting, communications. Within the third hour, those networks weren't theirs anymore. Human AI infiltrated their systems, faster than anything they had ever seen. Firewalls crumbled in seconds. Commands were rewritten. Ships that were once Imperial turned on their own. Cruisers unloaded their payloads into unsuspecting allies. Battleships powered down in the middle of combat. Entire wings of starfighters spiraled into each other, unable to tell friend from foe. By the fourth hour, half the fleet was gone. The Resistance had expected a war of attrition. They had braced themselves for another hopeless stand. But all they could do was watch. This wasn't war. This was a dismantling. The Empire's forces, once thought invincible, were being erased. Not with brute force, not with overwhelming numbers, but with tactics they had never conceived of. Human ships didn't engage in direct combat unless they had to. When they did, it was over in seconds. Their weapons didn't just destroy, they ended fights before they began. By the fifth hour, the Imperial fleet's command structure was in ruins. Their admirals were dead before they realized they were being targeted. Precision strikes had decapitated leadership across the battlefield. The fleet was leaderless, defenseless. By the sixth hour, the Empire's soldiers, once unwavering in their loyalty, did something unthinkable. They abandoned ship. They had fought wars for generations. They had been taught that surrender was never an option. But this wasn't war. This was annihilation. By the seventh hour, the Empire begged for surrender. The battlefield was silent. Wreckage drifted in the void where the Empire's fleet once stood. Fires burned in the husks of ships that had, just hours ago, represented the pinnacle of military dominance. Now, they were nothing more than debris. The war was over. The Resistance didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They just stared at the aftermath, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The war they had fought for decades, the war that had cost them billions of lives, had ended in 7 hours. Their leaders stood before humanity, still trying to comprehend it. Some wanted to thank them. Others wanted to demand an explanation. But none could find the words. The sheer scale of it was too much. They had begged for humanity's help for years, believing even a minor effort could turn the tide. But this wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a war. It was an execution. They began to understand why humanity had waited. One of the Resistance commanders, a hardened warrior who had lost everything, finally spoke. You could have done this at any time. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. The human representative didn't deny it. Yes. The truth settled over them. Humanity had watched, observed, measured the conflict, and only now had they acted. Not out of desperation, not out of necessity, but by choice. The implications were terrifying. The Empire, once feared across the stars, no longer existed as a military power. Their fleets were gone. Their leaders, if they still lived, had no command left to give. Worlds that had suffered under their rule wasted no time in rising up. The chains of oppression had been broken, and there was no one left to hold them. News of the 7-hour war spread faster than the Resistance could contain it. Across the galaxy, governments scrambled to make sense of what had happened. Some tried to deny it. Others refused to believe the reports. But the wreckage of the Empire's fleet was undeniable. The war had ended before most had even realized it had begun. For some, it was a moment of hope. Proof that the Empire wasn't eternal. That even the mightiest could fall. For others, it was something else entirely. Fear. The realization that a power far greater than the Empire existed. One that had remained in the shadows, silent, patient. Not because they were weak, but because they had never needed to act. The Empire's mistake had been forcing their hand. 100 different species, 100 different governments, all asked the same question. What happens if humanity ever decides they don't want peace? The answer was already written in the ruins of the Empire's fleet. Humanity had just redrawn the balance of power in the galaxy. And no one would ever look at them the same way again. The galaxy was different now. The old order had collapsed in a matter of hours, and in its place, uncertainty reigned. The resistance, once fighting for survival, now found itself in control of a shattered battlefield. The empire, once thought indestructible, was nothing more than a fractured remnant of what it had been. Worlds that had lived in fear of imperial fleets now stood free. Former slaves took up arms, not to fight, but to rebuild. The chains that had bound them for generations had been broken not by their own hands, but by an outside force none had expected. The name humanity was now spoken with reverence, fear, and something else, caution. They had won a war in 7 hours. Not through brute force, not through overwhelming numbers, but with cold, calculated precision. The rest of the galaxy watched, uncertain of what came next. Humanity did not claim the spoils of war. They did not demand tribute, territory, or control. They had no interest in ruling. That terrified the galaxy more than anything else. Every great empire had wanted power. Humanity had proved they already had it and that they didn't need to use it. That restraint, that deliberate choice, was more unnerving than conquest. Because it meant that, at any moment, if humanity decided the galaxy was a problem, they could solve it in hours. For the resistance, the war was over, but the questions remained. What kind of future awaited them now? What kind of galaxy had humanity just created? The answer was simple. A galaxy that would never be the same again. Nations scrambled to secure alliances. Treaties were rewritten overnight. Those who had once ignored humanity now begged for their favor. Some offered wealth. Others offered technology. A few simply wanted guarantees that they would never face what the Empire had. But humanity wasn't interested in ruling. They had come, done what was necessary, and now they were leaving. A message was sent to every government in the known galaxy. It contained no threats, no ultimatums, just a statement of fact. We are not conquerors. We are not oppressors. But if you threaten us or those under our protection, we will end you. It was not a warning. It was a promise. No one doubted it. The war had ended in 7 hours. The galaxy had changed forever. And from this moment on, no one would ever dare test humanity again. Not because they were feared. Not because they were ruthless. But because they had already proven they didn't need war to win it.